So hello and welcome to another one of our webinars from AFRY Management Consulting. I am extremely pleased to say that we're joined by Francisco Leveron from Iberdrola, who is joining us today to talk about decarbonisation in Spain, and the theme here is towards cheaper energy bills and higher investments. So I think it'd be quite an interesting topic. If we can skip through to the introduction slides, you can see myself there. I'm Matt Brown, I'm Vice President at AFRY Management Consulting. Francisco, maybe if you would introduce yourself, please.
Yes, thank you, Matt. I am Francisco Leveron. I work for Iberdrola. I'm head of energy perspective in the innovation direction, and one of my tasks is to try to see what is going to happen in the sector in the long term. Thank you.
Many thanks. Dorian.
Hi, sorry for this. I'm Dorian. I'm a senior principal at AFRY Management Consulting, based in our Madrid office, where I'm in charge, among other things, of all projects and development related to decarbonization in Iberia.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get into the presentation itself. So if you could skip on one for me, Dorian. Just say I think we're booked for 45 minutes today, so probably about 30 minutes presentation, and we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end. We've got a number of questions that have come through, and we'll have some good discussion, I hope. But please do ask questions all the way through. I'll be looking at the question pane as well and picking up some of those. We'll get back to people if there are questions that we haven't answered, so we'll pick up and email you wherever we can. And the slide pack and recording get emailed out. And just as a plug to say that if you were to look for the series of our energy transition webinars that we've been doing, you can find all of the back catalogue, the materials and the webinars recorded themselves, all available on our website. And I think if you just have a Google around AFRY energy webinars, then you'll find it. So with that, I will hand over, I think it is to Francisco, to kick us off. Thanks very much, and I'll be back for the Q&A.
Thank you, Matt. Just for introduction, I wanted to explain how this report came out, and basically some 2 or 3 years ago, I attended a presentation done by AFRY's team about an assessment of the decarbonization of the European energy sector, comparing two scenarios, a 100% electrified economy and a gas optimized pathway. And I saw it really interesting. And after the presentation, I asked Dorian if they could do an optimized pathway, but with updated technology costs, as renewables and battery costs were declining so quickly. So this new analysis lays down a minimum cost scenario to reach a complete decarbonization of the European energy sector by 2050, and with a special focus on Spain and the UK, where we are mainly present here in Europe. So it is important to have in mind that this is the only constraint of the study, so no emissions, there is no other condition. So, and when we saw the results, we were very pleased, as it stated that the most economical way to decarbonize the energy sector was through a deep electrification, close to 70%, and with hydrogen as its best complement. But after the study, we were very curious, like other people we shared the study with, about the cost, not just of the energy coming out of this pathway, but also of its use in transport and heating. So again, we asked AFRY's team to see if it was possible to have this data from the study, as it was quite complex and a first of its kind analysis, we decided to focus only on Spain. And I think this is really a primer. I really don't know any other study giving the most economical pathway towards decarbonization and its implication on costs and investment in so many detail. So we are again very pleased with the results, but also feeling that we are contributing to the public debate with new and very valuable information.
Okay, thank you, Francisco. So after this introduction, I will go through a number of results and graphs to show first, to remind you, for the ones that know the work we did last year with Iberdrola, remind you of the main results for Europe and for Spain. And then we'll focus on today's topic with the results of our latest update on this study. That is what Francisco just mentioned. Let's say the implication of this transition in Spain in terms of costs for end users, individuals and businesses, and as well investments, no, that will derive under this pathway from the transition. So first, just a reminder of what we did last year and what was published last year. I mean, all what we are showing today is has been public and is available on our website and on Iberdrola's as well. So this, what you can see here, is part of the results of the main study. That is the fuel use. The fuel used in different sectors of the European energy sector, the different sectors. So that's buildings, heating, industrial heat, transport, and power generation along the transition. So first, focusing on buildings heating, what we see is that while today heating, space heating, the heating of households, of businesses, it relies mainly currently on natural gas, especially in Northern Europe. What we see is that at the end of the transition in 2050, 80% of buildings heat is electrified. That's about a strong electrification. Okay, in the industry, this electrification is much more limited. Okay, the reason for that, that's in our main report, is that we've taken an assumption with Iberdrola in our modeling that only temperature below 200 degrees in industries could be electrified. That above or beyond 200 degrees, you need to use other fuels, mainly to reach decarbonization, zero carbon gases, which are natural gas when associated with CCS, the biomethane, and of course, hydrogen. So what we see here is that in Europe, in industries, zero carbon gases keep a very important role, right? The third sector is transport. And again, as in the buildings heat sector, we go towards a very deep electrification, There is a small share in terms of kilometers driven of hydrogen that corresponds mainly to heavy trucks. Even if in this scenario with Iberdrola, what we took an assumption of quite a relevant share of electrification for heavy trucks, as we took an assumption of e-highways. Let's say that the main highways corridors in Europe would be electrified so that electric trucks could use them without battery, basically. And then at last, in the power generation sector, what we see is for Europe under this pathway, the result we got was an 80% growth of demand of power generation, between 2020 and 2050. mainly to supply the massive electrification of heat and transport, but also to feed electrolyzers, as one of the key results of our study is that in 2050 in Europe, for the decarbonization, we will need 800 terawatt hours of green hydrogen produced. So very important, because I didn't want to add too many slides, but behind all this, of course, one of the key aspects of our modeling is that with such a transition where in 2050, in a decarbonized world, all the generation, almost all the generation is renewable, we go from a world today where we have, let's say, flexible generation matching at any moment inflexible demand, to a world in 2050 where you have inflexible generation that will need to be matched at any moment by flexible demand. And that is made possible in our modeling through distributed flexibility, distributed storage, mainly through EVs and vehicle to grid. So that means cars, electric cars, able to send back electricity energy to the grids when needed, typically, for instance, at night if there is no wind. Okay, that's very important. Other aspect is also from our study is that it's key to reach this decarbonization, that interconnections between European markets are reinforced. We believe that they need to be, the interconnection capacity in Europe need to be multiplied by almost 3 to make it possible. So where do we get? With such a pathway, of course, we get to very high electrification numbers, right? So in 2050, our modeling ends up with 80% electrification in transport in Europe, 70% in buildings heat, 48% in industry, and in total that is 62%. In industry, it's more limited, as we said, because of high temperature requirements that cannot be easily electrified. In the decarbonization, it's mostly, to be clear, in Europe about the abandonment of fossil fuels as primary energy. So that's oil and coal. But what you see is that in 2050, in our modeling, we end up with still a significant volume of natural gas, in that case associated with CCS, because we don't see a sufficient potential from biomethane and, let's say, affordable hydrogen, green hydrogen, to supply the whole demand for heat in the industry. So that's why our modeling still says, okay, you need a natural gas with CCS to get there. And also important, it's not only about 2050, what happens on the way. With this modeling, we get to a 59% reduction of emissions in 2030 compared to 1990. So that's a bit above current ambition of the European Commission, but that's pretty in line. Now, again, talking about our last year study, but now focusing on Spain, what do we see? We see that decarbonization pathway in Spain is pretty in line, is broadly in line with what happens in Europe, with small interesting differences. The first one is that while electrification in buildings heat in Europe gets to 80%, in Spain, in our modeling, it gets to 100%, or roughly, or 98, or 99%, as you can see on the first graph. On the second graph, what you can see is that for industrial heat, the behavior of the transition is the same, except that we reach an electrification of industrial heat, which is a bit less in Spain than in European average. That is due to the structure of Spanish industry, which is using higher temperature in average than other European countries. In transport, let's say the goal arrival point is the same as in the rest of Europe, but on the way it's pretty different. Our models end up with a quicker electrification of transport than European average in Spain, mainly because of the competitiveness of electricity in Spain compared to other countries in this modeling, driven by around 2040 by more renewable resource, okay, and lesser investments in the networks mainly. So that's the reason why the electrification of transport goes a bit quicker. And in terms of generation, in Spain, it's even more renewable, let's say, than in the rest of Europe. And you can see that in 2050, solar, PV, onshore wind, and hydro makes up for 95% of generation in Spain. So that is what we did in 2020 with Iberdrola. And as Francisco said, and these results were really nice and interesting, but then this question came, well, but what is the impact of this on end users, on investments? I mean, is this transition affordable, basically, for the society? And we're thinking about how maybe we can look at this at European scale, but that's really too big. That's too much work, and Iberdrola will not pay for that. So we decided to focus on Spain and trying to answer two key questions. First one is, what is the impact of this transition on energy costs for Spanish end users, individuals and businesses? And sorry, how big are the needed investments in each sector? So that's the points we tackled in the recently published update available on our website, and we are going to go through the results today. So first, starting with the Spanish transport sector. I mean, the first graph shows that already in 2020, ICE vehicles and EVs and PHEV, in terms of total costs, are total costs of these different technologies are in line. I mean, what is total cost? They include capex. So of course, today it will be higher for EV than for ICE vehicles. ICE is, for those of you who don't know, it's internal combustion engines, for the traditional car, for instance. But it also includes fuel costs and maintenance. So of course, fuel costs, electricity for EV is much more competitive than gasoline in our projections, which makes, let's say, EV and IC comparable in terms of cost today through the whole lifetime of the vehicle. But then, driven by the growing competitiveness of batteries and by more competitive electricity prices, EVs already in 2030 are much more competitive than ICEs, which remain at the same level of 26 cents per kilometer. And this goes growing in 2040, and in 2050 you only see an orange bar because other technologies than EV are not allowed in our modeling in the small passenger segment. Can be hydrogen vehicle, but we don't see them competitive at this horizon. Then the second graph shows the average transport cost. Okay, so that's not only small passenger cars, but also all vehicles in Spain. That's the reason why the costs are a bit higher than in the first graph, because it also includes vans and trucks, who have higher costs due to their size and the loads they carry. So what we see is that in average, these costs are going down by 20% from 2020 to 2050, mainly driven by the competitiveness of EVs. Okay, so we reach a decarbonization of this sector in our modeling in 2050 with lower costs, lower transport unitary costs than in 2020. And then in terms of investments, we see investment growing significantly across the period. So mainly due first to the mileage, because in our projections, we took into account a significant increase in terms of kilometers driven in Spain, okay? And the second aspect is that we include there more costly, low-emitting alternatives, so typically fuel cell hydrogen trucks, okay? So that contributes to have higher investments on the pathway. Then looking at the Spanish heat sector. A lot of information here. So if we first focus on the two first graphs, which shows heat production costs for buildings in Spain and for processes, and they also show the share of electricity and zero carbon gases to produce this heat. What we observe is that for buildings, heating costs decrease with the penetration with electrification, with growing electrification, which means with the penetration of air source heat pumps. Because of course, air source heat pumps installation in households can be a costly investment, but due to their very high efficiency, I mean, with the mild climate you have in Spain, you can reach efficiency above 300%, up to 400%, and also with the declining price of electricity that we will comment later on. Of course, in the end, the cost of heat production for households and for buildings in general is going down. In the industries, it's pretty striking to see that reaching by 2050 the full decarbonization of industrial heat, basically by the growing penetration of zero carbon gases and also the increase of electrification for lower temperature processes. In the end, in 2050, the cost of heat production remains more or less in line with what we have today. So that's a very important finding as well. Then if we look at overall heat production cost unitary in Spain along the pathway, there is a small reduction between 2020 and 2050. It remains below 10%, I think. But the key idea, the key result here is that we believe through our modeling that we can actually achieve the full decarbonization of the heat sector in Spain, buildings and industries and processes, keeping, let's say, stable costs, which is, I believe, a very interesting result. And to me, the most interesting result regarding the heat sector in Spain is about the investments needed. So that's the last graph. And what you can see here is that the deployment of decarbonized appliances for heat in Spain, in buildings and in industries, implies massive investments. If you sum the three bars here, you reach roughly 600 billion euros in the three coming decades. So 600 billion euros needed to decarbonize that sector. And so, I mean, clearly what this shows is that 600 billion is in the end to in average 20 billion euros a year, okay? And that is roughly, that's in average, and that is roughly between 1.5 and 2% of current Spanish GDP. So you see that this sector can be a real driver for growth for the Spanish economy in the coming years and decades. So that's one of the key aspects of key finding of this study. Then last slide for me on the power sector in Spain. So the idea here is to look at what is going to happen basically with the electricity bills and investments in the power sector. So on the first graph, what we've represented, it's the total costs of the power system from now to 2050 in Spain. So what are the elements or the items in this total cost? The first one, that's the orange bars, is generation cost. So generation costs, it's mainly wholesale prices, Spanish pool price, plus the price of ancillary services times the total generation. That's the wholesale market costs. In blue, that's the power network costs. So that is the cost of operating and developing existing and future networks, as we need to increase a lot the capacity of the networks to incorporate new renewables, but also to supply new demand or growing demand. And also we need investments that we took into account for to make networks smart, mainly to manage distributed flexibility and demand side flexibility, as mentioned before. Okay. The third element in this total cost is the missing money. So what is the missing money? It is the extra remuneration which is needed by some generation assets to be profitable, basically because they cannot achieve in the market, in the wholesale market, sufficient revenues to be profitable. So that's on the one hand mainly renewable, subsidized renewables, which needs to compensation between their LCOE and wholesale prices, and on the other end, it will be firm capacity, typically CCGTs that are needed along the way to guarantee the security of supply, but with very low running hours, very few hours running. They actually need payments to remain operational. Okay. And the fourth element of this total costs is what we call other costs. So other costs, it includes, you see that in 2020 in yellow, it's an important item. It includes the repayment of past tariff deficit in Spain, that gradually disappears, and then in the long term, other costs are mainly costs related to extra peninsular costs, let's say specific costs to the islands, to the Balearics and to Canarias. So the important thing on this graph is that each item, the value of each item, let's say, evolves, moves during along the pathway, but in the end, the total costs are fairly stable, around 30 billion euros a year. So now, if we're looking at the unitary costs of electricity, to answer the question, how will the electricity bills of Spanish individuals and businesses will evolve along the way? So you can see here that actually, out of our modeling, we see that the unitary final price of electricity will go down sharply by 83%. And how is that possible? Basically, because the average unitary price of electricity final is the ratio between the total costs of the system, which we saw is basically stable, and demand. And demand, we saw that in the case of Spain, it's growing by 80% during the transition. So stable costs, but growing demand. Of course, you end up with much cheaper and competitive electricity for final users. That's what you can see here. And then the last graph for me, the last graph on this slide in terms of investments. Of course, what we see out of our modeling is that the investments needed to achieve this pathway in the power system, the Spanish power system, are huge. And we are talking, for instance, for this decade where we are, 2021, 2030, of necessary increase in investments in the power system of 150% compared to the previous decade. So I think that's enough graphs and numbers for today. So now I'll let Francisco share with you the takeaways of this webinar and also tell us why Iberdrola is so happy with these results.
Thank you, Dorian. And yes, I think the report has very clear takeaways, at least for us. So first is that electricity can be cleaned up with renewables, and this clean electricity can also clean up transport through electric vehicles and heating through heat pumps. So with clean electrification, we can decarbonize most of our current energy uses. The second takeaway is that the report confirms also that this is the most economic way to do it, but not just this, also that a decarbonized energy sector is not just feasible, but will lower electricity bills and transportation and heating costs. And this is, of course, very important also. The third one is that at the same time, it will bring massive investments, creating huge industrial opportunities and new economy and jobs. And finally, we think that these benefits will allow to take care of sectors or regions hit by the energy transition. And for us as an electricity company, these results are very important because they confirm that our bet for renewables in electricity and networks, and also green hydrogen production, is the way to go. Also, these results give us confidence that policymakers will also bet for these technologies and options, giving us some comfort and visibility in the long run. And finally, I think that these positive results of lowering energy bills and creating economic opportunities for all will facilitate social acceptance of the energy transition. And of course, we think that this is a key aspect for the energy transition to be successful. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, both. Let me see if I can pop my webcam on and maybe ask Dorian to join us as well. I think that was very interesting. Good results, and of course that social acceptability that you mentioned there at the end, Francisco, is absolutely crucial. This sort of socio-technical transition that we need to make, it has to be obviously acceptable to the public, to the consumers as well. So that's a very, very important aspect. I have a few questions here which I would like to ask in the remaining time. First one here, I think perhaps Francisco, you could have a go at this. Why do costs go down if investments are going up?
Yes, I think that Dorian introduced this concept. I think that here we have to take into account the total cost of ownership. So when you have a car or a heater for your home, you have two kinds of expenses. The initial cost is the investment when you buy the car or the heater, and then you have the operational costs, basically the energy to run them in the following years. So when you change from a gas boiler to a heat pump, the initial cost is higher, but due to the high efficiency of these machines, more or less 4 times less energy consuming than boilers, the operational costs are much cheaper. So along the life of the heat pump, total costs are lower than the heater's costs. And with cars is similar, as EVs are much more efficient than petrol cars. But here there is a big difference because EVs are now more expensive than internal combustion engines, but they are expected to drop because the reduction of the battery cost. So from 2030, both type of costs, the initial investment and the running cost, will be lower if we change from internal combustion engines to electric mobility. So this is the reason why, changing from the reason why we are changing from a low investment, high expenses to to a high investment and low expenses economy.
Understood. Thank you for that. So next question, again, perhaps for you, Francisco. Can you elaborate more regarding the main impacts on the economy?
Yes, well, I mean, I'm not an economist, but we are starting to think on this because, of course, this is important. So, what first comes to my mind is that when you see the macroeconomic formula for the GDP, going from this high expense, low investment economy to another based on high investment and low expenses has very positive effects. So the first one is that less imports impact directly on GDP growth. So for example, in Spain, we import fossil fuels for an amount of 25 billion euros per year. So if we stop these imports, this will go directly to GDP growth. Also, more investments mean higher GDP also. And this is important because we need to maximize the part of the value chain that remains in Spain and in Europe. So if you are successful at avoiding this fossil fuel import and you change to investment, you have this is an opportunity, but you know, your country or your economy has to be able to take advantage of this by having all this investment and all this value chain in your country. Also, cheaper energy means that people will have money to expend in more valuable consumption. And finally, I mean, it is said and it's true that this electrification will lessen the tax collection from gasoline and diesel vehicles, but with more GDP, you will have also more tax collection coming from corporate taxes and value-added taxes. And I don't know exactly how will this compensate. So I think that this is a really good question, and probably this will be our next analysis to perform of this pathway.
Very good, thank you. Next question, one for you, Dorian, is full electrification of buildings in Spain a realistic vision?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. Is the full electrification realistic? Probably 100% not. I mean, it's very difficult. But when you look at a load, I mean, in terms of, we're doing modeling, no, that's modeling exercise here. When you look at the allowed options in a decarbonized world to heat buildings, there are not so many. If you want to electrify, that's air source heat pumps, of course, most efficient solution. That can be resistive electric heating, but that's very not efficient and very costly. And then, okay, you can think about maybe that some households, some building can keep boilers to burn, for instance, biomethane, but we know that the potential for biomethane is quite limited in Europe. It is there, it's not, especially in Spain, it's not, we're not taking advantage of it so far because there's no regulation that really push for it, but why not? But I believe that biomethane will have more value in industries than in buildings. And the last option can be maybe hydrogen. So some people believe that maybe we can keep some gas networks, distribution gas networks, to be used with hydrogen that would be delivered to households and to buildings for heat. Some believe that, some others think that's unrealistic. So, and in any case, in our modeling exercise, that's much more costly than air source heat pumps, and that's the reason why for Spain where the climate is much milder than in other countries, we end up with 100% electrification.
Okay, thank you very much. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Am I right in thinking there's not that much district heating and cooling in Spain currently?
If you compare to Finland, of course not. But there are a few. There is a capacity relevant in Spain of district heating, but of course that's nothing compared to northern countries. Do you want Francisco to add something on this?
No, I mean, you're correct. Properly talking, this is true. We have, I mean, it's not the same, but in Spain, in big cities, in big buildings, we have central heating for all the buildings. So this is not district heating, but it's like in the midway from individual heating to district heating. And you can install, for example, a big heat pump that could substitute this large gas heater.
Okay, interesting. Okay. Excuse me. I'm very interested in district cooling as well, because we're seeing more and more interest in hot countries in district cooling as an option, and because of the store capabilities that you could have, that could provide some real flexibility in the system as well, if as an alternative. So I think that's a really interesting topic for the future. Last question, I think, given the time. Dorian, why did you say that investments needed in the power system in Spain are less in proportion than in other European countries?
Yes, actually, they are in line with a bit below European average, but far below some Northern Europe countries like the UK, for instance, mostly because in the UK, that's mainly linked to the heat sector. Because if you take the UK, I mean, most of buildings are using natural gas to produce heat. And if you want to deeply electrify this, that needs that in terms of demand, of new electricity demand, and the corresponding networks developments that you need to replace natural gas for heating by electricity, I mean, the corresponding investments are huge in the power network. While in Spain, where we have a significant part of the country which is actually not where households are not, buildings are not heated, typically in Andalusia, on the south of the country, and where the electrification is a bit more than in the UK, for instance, in the corresponding investments to switch from natural gas or LPGs or other fuels to electricity for heating is much less in proportion, yes.
Okay, very good, thank you. As time is chasing us quickly, I would just like to really close here and say thank you very much, both to you, Francisco, and to you, Dorian. I found that very engaging. If anyone's got any follow-up and you want to ask further questions, please do just reach out and contact us. Very happy to discuss further. And of course, we'll have more webinars coming up shortly. So please stay tuned for that. Yeah, Francisco, Dorian, anything you'd like to just close with?
Dorian?
No, I mean, thank you very much, Francisco and Matt, for this webinar. Of course, as Matt said, just reach out to us if you have any question or any view, anything that you would like to share about all these numbers. And maybe just say also that we did that for Spain, but we can do that for other countries. That's a lot of work, that's a lot of modeling, but we're able to do that. And I think it's always very interesting to see and that's quite new to see what the impact of the transition can be on the economy. So yeah, that's it for me. Thank you.
And Matt, just a quick comment. I think that we are in times of very, very rapid change because of technology evolution, because especially climate change. These are the two key levers for all the changes that we are seeing. And I think it's very important to try to have a view on the future to make good decisions and take the correct policies and correct investments. So I think that this is very, very useful.
Excellent. Thanks all, and thanks everyone for joining. Hope you enjoyed it as well. And thanks to Edwin for the organisation. And I think we'll finish there. Bye bye.
Thank you.